bit more up close and personal this time, so we're not in any danger of the microphone causing me to sound too much like a Dalek. Although, as it happens, I have in the past been described by the good boys and girls of Brighton Antifa, no less, as having the charisma and rhetorical flair of a depressed Dalek. I hope you will bear with me. Politics, as defined by Francis Parker Yockey, is a plenum, that is to say, a space completely occupied by material, the opposite of a vacuum. The only way to make room for your own ideas is to fight the current occupants and fight them to the finish. Let me begin by saying that everyone assembled here today is worth 1,000 of the e-celebrities who populate the digital cesspool known as the online right, or the inebriated attendees at Teflon Tommy's Tel Aviv Solidarity rallies. After decades of defeat, despair and dilution, something is moving in the soul of this country. The wheel is turning! Make no mistake, we are not here to play the role of loyal opposition to the liberal order. We are here to replace it. So, to try to make some sense of our current situation and hopefully provide some ideations for the struggle ahead, I'm going to take you on a sort of graveyard tour, not to wallow in any nostalgia, but to derive some cold, hard lessons from the high and low points of the past. And to do that, I'm going to have to take you back in time to 1948, in fact, when Britain was on her knees, cities were still bomb sites, rationing was tighter than during the war, and the empire was being dismantled by Clement Attlee's class war regime and the international money power behind them. Into this misery stepped Sir Oswald Mosley, unbowed by 3 years of eating weevil-ridden porridge in Holloway prison for the crime of wanting peace, and his union movement, the first serious attempt after the war to raise the banner again. In the East End of London, in the slums of Manchester and Nottingham, thousands turned out to hear him speak, proving that the old fire was still there. The Board of Deputies and the Home Office went into hysteria. The main difference between the Union movement and the pre-war British Union of Fascists was the concept of Europe a nation. This was not the bankers' Europe of Brussels, the ruthless consumer zone of today's European Union, but a fortress Europe, self-sufficient, racially conscious, a third force standing against both Washington and Moscow. A vision which I believe is still today the only strategic alternative to the dominant global system. Yet for all its intellectual brilliance, and the writings of both Mosley and Alexander Raven Thompson are indeed works of genius, the Union movement never solved the problem of street-level organisation. One harsh but fair criticism from the anti-Mosley wing of nationalism was that for much of the 1950s, the leader himself was absent, living in exile in Ireland and France, and leaving the day-to-day fight to men such as Geoffrey Ham and Victor Burgess. Meanwhile, one comrade who never left the field was Arthur Kenneth Chesterton, or AK as he was known. Chesterton had begun his political career alongside Mosley in the BUF days, and in 1954 returned to the front lines when he launched the League of Empire Loyalists with the mission of defending the British Empire from the menace of international communism. The League had talent for headline-grabbing stunts that humiliated the whole establishment, bursting into Conservative Party meetings and shouting, "Traitors!" or throwing buckets of flour over Soviet stooges. The League rejected the Union movement's call for a united Europe and radical social reform, but both were opposed to the money power, both were opposed to coloured immigration, and both defended white rule in South Africa and Rhodesia to the hilt. However, by the early 1960s, both organisations were starting to stagnate somewhat. The main reason for this was that for ordinary people in Britain, wages and living standards had now improved massively. Mosley's pan-European vision, while still a light on the horizon, didn't resonate with the working man who now had a Ford Anglia in his drive and a fridge full of tin spam. while Chesterton's dream of reviving the British Empire seemed anachronistic and archaic. The League of Empire Loyalists stood a number of candidates for election around this time and achieved frankly embarrassing results, though one of their members did make the headlines by throwing sheep guts over the President of Kenya. Then came a flash of hope. This was the British National Party, not related to the BNP founded by John Tyndall in 1982, which most of you will associate with that name, though Mr. Tyndall was a member. The 1960s BNP was led by John Bean, who had previously been active in both the Union movement and the League of Empire Loyalists, and Andrew Fontaine, a former Royal Navy officer with a background in the old guard of the Tory party, and who as a very young man had fought as a volunteer for Franco in the Spanish Civil War. They were joined by Colin Jordan, designated heir of the late Imperial Fascist League leader Arnold Leese. However, this alliance didn't last. Bean and Fontaine wanted an electorally viable party focused on opposing coloured immigration. Jordan wanted a smaller militant organisation focused on the Jewish question and the rehabilitation of Adolf Hitler and National Socialist Germany. This led to an acrimonious split. Jordan, along with John Tyndall and their supporters, left the BNP to found the National Socialist Movement, later relaunched as the British Movement. Meanwhile, the little BNP that remained punched above its weight. Some of you may know an area of West London called Southall, which is now known as Little India, on account of there being a higher concentration of Indians living there than anywhere in the world outside India. But in 1963, though Southall was already starting to experience the phenomenon of white flight, the population was still 88% white British, and a brave lady named Doris Hart stood for the BNP as a councillor and took 27.9% of the vote. The following year, John Bean himself stood for the parliamentary seat and got 9%. More impressive than it might sound, since in those days a good 84% of the population actually bothered to get out and vote. The 1960s BNP stands as an example of how doorstep-based grassroots campaigning can rally a native population in defence of their community. 3 years on, the League of Empire Loyalists and the British National Party, together with another group, the Racial Preservation Society, merged to form a new party, which for several years looked as if it might succeed in breaking the liberal plenum Francis Parker Yockey warned us about. This was the National Front, launched in February 1967, with A.K. Chesterton, the old warrior himself, as its first chairman. Within the year, Chesterton had patched things up with John Tyndall, who by that point had fallen out with Colin Jordan and started his own Greater Britain movement, which was also incorporated into the National Front. The respectable man and the militant man, the theoretician and the street agitator were under one roof at last. For a few glorious years in the 1970s, the National Front was the coming force. In the West Midlands, the NF took 20 to 25% in some council wards, and in the 1977 Greater London Council elections averaged over 10%. And let it never be said that the NF was just a fringe party. In the latter half of the 1970s, it was a countercultural earthquake. NF spray-painted in white emulsion on every railway bridge, every factory wall, every school toilet door, still lives in the folk memory. It was the original viral meme before the internet was invented. The music press were terrified, denouncing racism and fascism, while half their audience was scrawling NF on their school bags. You had Eric Clapton drunkenly shouting, "Keep Britain White," on stage in Birmingham. You had David Bowie doing what looked suspiciously like a Sieg Heil at Victoria Station, and later claiming it was just the angle. Pull the other one, Ziggy. Even Rod Stewart said there were too many immigrants in Britain and refused to disavow the NF outright. Punk was split down the middle. Susie Sue wore a swastika armband for shock value. Screwdriver started in 1976 as just another punk band, and within 5 years had become every skinhead's personal soundtrack. So why did the NF fail? Many people claim Margaret Thatcher stole their thunder with her promises to get tough on immigration, which, needless to say, never materialised. Others blame the early photos of John Tyndall with Colin Jordan, complete with paramilitary outfits and swastika flags, for alienating many potential voters. However, splinter parties with less baggage that attempted to court mainstream respectability, what would today be called sensible nationalism, actually got less impressive results than the NF at the ballot box. John Bean, who I think would have known as well as anyone, argued that the NF's fundamental failing was to focus overly on the symptoms, coloured immigration, rather than the underlying cause, the international finance capitalist system which seeks the free movement of labour and capital in the service of profit. The failure to obtain a breakthrough at the 1979 general election led to the NF tearing itself apart. John Tyndall led his followers to form a breakaway faction called the New National Front, which in 1982 changed its name to the British National Party, the fourth party to use this name, and certainly the best known. The 1980s and 1990s were wilderness years, with some glory and plenty of grief. It isn't until the 2000s that we reach another peak in our story, with the meteoric rise and fall of the BNP under Nick Griffin's leadership. In the 2000s, the BNP achieved what no insurgent political party in Britain had done since the war. 55 local council seats, 3 county councillors, 2 MEPs in Brussels, nearly 1 million votes in the 2009 European elections, and 500,000 in the 2010 general election. For a brief moment, the Liberal plenum was cracked and light shone through. Then, in the space of 18 months, it was all gone. By the end of 2012, the BNP was reduced to just 3 councillors nationwide, a handful of decimated branches, and a website no one was reading. The regime's favourite controlled opposition mouthpiece, Mr. Farage, struts around claiming that he killed the BNP, whereas Mr. Griffin will tell you the BNP was destroyed by establishment persecution and, ironically, as we shall see, Zionist smears. The truth, as anyone who was involved in those days will recall, was rather uglier. By the mid-2000s, the BNP leadership had made a clear decision to take the party in the direction of what is now known as civic nationalism, which calls for nationalists to accept the fundamental principles of the liberal democratic order and to purge individuals and ideas that might clash with those principles. In practical terms, this amounts to anti-Islamism as a mobilization tool, a pro-Israel geopolitics, and a populism that pits the masses against the elites of the political media class, but does not challenge the capitalist economic system. We saw the phenomenon of BNP-aligned blogs and forum posters making statements like, "Our mission is to preserve our culture. When all is said and done, race is not the issue, only culture and nationality. If you don't like that, sod off." We saw a gentleman of indeterminate ethnic origin named Sharif Abdul Gawad, later convicted for heroin possession, standing as a BNP candidate in Bradford. We saw Lee Barnes, the BNP's legal advisor, proclaiming that Israel was the only living organic nationalist state on the planet. We saw BNP literature glorifying Winston Churchill, the drunkard who bankrupted and ruined Britain, as a British nationalist icon. We saw Nick Griffin on Question Time, our one chance to speak to 10 million Britons unfiltered, boasting that the real Nazis in Britain hated him because he supported Israel against Hamas. Just imagine, Rochdale and Rotherham are burning with Pakistani grooming gangs, and the leader of the British National Party is declaring on national TV that the litmus test of human decency is whether or not you support Tel Aviv in a Middle Eastern conflict. Extraordinarily enough, Mr. Griffin has claimed in more recent years that while on a trip to the United States in 2007, he was offered millions by undisclosed Zionist neocons to take the BNP in an anti-Islam, pro-Israel direction, but that he heroically turned it down. All I will say is that if such an offer was made, it's clear his answer was something like, "Okay, yes, where do I sign?" Meanwhile, the BNP's finances were being looted on an industrial scale by the leadership clique, with a fundraiser who paid himself £10,000 a week out of party funds, mysterious fake companies and consultancy fees, and mysterious properties in Croatia that appeared in certain people's names. When the inevitable court cases and leaks came, hard-working activists were left stunned and broken. So the BNP is an example of how a party can win 1 million votes and still fail because it had surrendered the principles that made those votes possible in the first place. Griffin clearly believed that becoming ideologically indistinguishable from the establishment would lead to victory. Instead, the Tory voters sloped off to UKIP because UKIP offered the same civic nationalist effluvia without the BNP's baggage, while the working class base felt betrayed and drifted away. The cold lesson written in the ruins is that electoral success built on a platform of self-neutering is worse than useless. A political insurgency cannot be fought from a position of least resistance. The moment you decide to play by the rules of the regime simply changes the rules and laughs at you. And yet, every year the regime survives, it discredits itself more completely. There are no technocratic tweaks that will halt the march of the economy toward the abyss, no financial wizardry that will restore life to the gutted husks of Britain's high streets. And every patch, every plaster, every reform merely hastens the end. And every year, more young men and women who have never known a country that belonged to its own people still find the will to fight for one anyway. The elites know this, which is why they're flooding the country with replacements, because they think a cosmopolitan serf population will be easier to rule among the ruins. When the lights go out again, and they will, when the cash machines stop working, when the supermarkets are empty for a week, when the police vanish and the cities burn again, the British people will not be turning to whichever martinets and apparatchiks of the Uniparty are in the ascendant, and they certainly won't be ringing Reform UK's hotline. They will be looking for the men and women who told them the truth all along and who never compromised with the spirit of a dying age. Britain will live again. We are still here, and we are coming.